Recently, we heard about the death of Cardinal George Pell, the former Archbishop of Melbourne and Sydney, Australia, who also was a major official of the Vatican. The highest ranking prelate in the church, who was accused of child abuse and then was put on trial and found guilty, only to be overturned by the Supreme Court of Australia, who found him completely and totally innocent, that he had been, if anything, persecuted. He passed away recently. We did an interview with him some months ago. It was a great interview, and we thought in honor of his passing, it would be good to share with our listeners on Personally Speaking our very recent interview with Cardinal George Pell. Please listen to this amazing churchman who made such a difference in so many ways for the good of our church. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr. Jim Lisante, and His Eminence Cardinal George Pell of Australia joins me now. Cardinal Pell is the former Secretary of the Economy at the Vatican, and he also served on Pope Francis's Council of Cardinals. On March 13, 2019, Cardinal Pell began what was meant to be 6 years in jail for, quote, historical sexual assault offenses, close quote. He endured more than 13 months in solitary confinement before the Australian High Court voted 7-0 to overturn his original conviction. Cardinal Pell relives his prison experience in his books called Prison Journal, and the third and final volume of the journal he wrote while in prison has just been released, titled Prison Journal Volume 3, The High Court Frees an Innocent Man. In this final volume of Cardinal Pell's journal, he recounts being freed from jail after his conviction was overturned, the support he received from all over the world, and how he made the decision to forgive his accusers. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking His Eminence Cardinal George Pell. Cardinal George Pell is our guest. Your Eminence, thanks for coming on the program. I have had the opportunity to go through the first edition of the Prison Journal and love it. I'm looking forward to the next two. First question. Mr. Navalny is in Germany safely. He goes back to Russia knowing Mr. Putin is probably going to put him in jail, and he does. Jimmy Lai, great Catholic, pro-democracy in Hong Kong, certainly as a billionaire, has the opportunity to get out of Hong Kong, stays put, and the government of China arrests him. Cardinal Pell, safe in Rome, but chooses to go back to Australia, to an environment that he knows is a kind of a lynch mob mentality when it comes to the church. Why did you go home?
Oh, well, there was no honorable alternative. I knew I was innocent, and I needed to go back home and establish that. If I'd stayed away, it would have been seen by many as tantamount to an admission of guilt. So it really wasn't an option for me not to go back. It was the only honorable thing to do.
Did you know, though, that you were walking into a highly hostile environment?
I knew it was very, very hostile, but I never believed for a moment that I would be convicted. Because the case against me was so weak.
Okay. Were you advised by folks at the Vatican to stay put, or were they open to the idea that you should go home and correct this thing?
No. I think they realized I had to go home, but I never gave them any opportunity to. Right. I had said that I was going home.
Your Eminence, one of the things that I find interesting as I read the first journal is the values that's made you the man that you are. Obviously come from many places, but among them is the family of origin. So when I see a guy who's tenacious and deeply invested in his faith and loving God a lot, I say, what kind of family formed him? When you look back, I know you're 80 now, when you look back to the family that raised you, the parents that raised you, what did they do right? And what did you learn from them?
I learned an enormous amount from them. Both of them were strong personalities. Mm-hmm. My father wasn't a Catholic. My mother was Irish-Australian. She was a Burke. She had 7 sisters. The Burke women never needed any feminist movement to remind them of their rights. and of their capacity to stand on their own feet and express their point of view. So my mother was a very strong person, and so was my father. They both loved me. It was only later as a priest when I came to see many families and to see just how so many children suffer in some families that I realized how good my family was, because I knew that my parents would do anything they could that was reasonable and good to support me. I never for a minute questioned their love or devotion to my welfare. And I had quite an extended family from mum's side in the city Ballarat, where I grew up. And the schools I attended in those days were faith-filled schools. I couldn't tell you even now the youngsters in my class at school who didn't go to Mass.
Wow.
Because if you didn't go to Mass, you didn't talk about it.
Right.
The overwhelming majority of us did.
Now, this non-Catholic father, how well did he take the idea of his son embracing the Catholic priesthood?
Oh no, he thought it was a terrible waste of time. He was very ambitious for me, and he thought it was a waste. He said it wouldn't have been bad if he used the Australian word "dill." It means it wouldn't have been so bad if I was a bit of a fool, if I was stupid and incapable, but he thought it was a terrible waste because I had a bit of capacity that I'd be going off into the priesthood. But he changed as he went along and became increasingly sympathetic. He never became a Catholic.
Okay.
He was religiously tone deaf, although nominally an Anglican Episcopalian, but he wasn't. He was a man of principles, very decent man, very forthright man. He wasn't well educated, but he could speak the old Australian that existed before television came in. So he could be very pithy and direct, and it was an interesting conversationalist.
The experience of the Ignatian retreat I went on years ago, I remember thinking 30 days of silence, I can handle this, being alone with just my Bible. I found about 2 weeks into the Ignatian retreat, it's not easy to be alone. How did Your Eminence handle the experience in prison of loneliness?
Well, I was trained in a pre-Vatican II seminary. So we used to have the Great Silence,
right,
which was started at about 6 o'clock in the evening and went through till 9 o'clock. Was pretty well observed. We had silence at meals. At the lunchtime, we had the middle of the day, the main meal we had, and then in the evening we had readings from the scriptures. So I said my time in a pre-Vatican II seminary was a good preparation for jail. But also another blessing in the jail, I was only interrupted 3 or 4 times a day for roll calls or meals, or sometimes called to go to the doctor or the lawyer. But the warders, when they would see you briefly, would be friendly and have not long conversations generally, but just a word or two. Now, it would have been very different if they were completely silent or snarling at you or hostile towards you. And I was in isolation. There were 11 other isolated cells. And it was the biggest surprise in jail, how decent they were. And as far as I could hear in the way they treated the other people in isolation, they were decent to them also. Very difficult work, because many of the people in isolation were terribly ruined by drugs. So they'd be angry and anguished, and some of them would protest. They'd flood their cells or soil their cells. Not many, but some did. Some would refuse to move, so they'd have to gas them and take them out. That only happened once or twice. But a difficult work for the warders. And in that part of the jail, at any rate, I think they did a good job.
Your Eminence, one of the things that is striking to me is that you went back to Australia thinking, I'm innocent, so there's no real danger here. And then you get convicted with great bias. I mention that because then you go to jail, and obviously you're hoping on appeal that things will change. But the real enemy there, it seems to me, is discouragement. When you really have such great hope and it's dashed by the unfairness of the process, and then you're in jail, how do you keep hope alive? Like, you may believe you're innocent till the end of time, but you may spend the end of time in jail. How did you deal with the real crisis many of us face of discouragement when the unfair happens?
Well, I think as priests, we have an obligation not to be discouraged. I mean, we're priests are leaders of their people. And now if we've got a clinical depression, or we're physically run down, very bad flu, well, there's no alternative to being depressed. But sometimes bad morale of being discouraged can be sort of narcissistic. We're just feeling sorry for ourselves. Because we're priests and leaders, we've got to keep ourselves together. If we're in bad morale, it's not good for the people that we serve. Now, one of the interesting things, if I slightly digress, about surveys about priestly morale, I remember in one of the surveys, many of the priests said, oh, yes, morale amongst the priests is bad, but my morale is good. And I think there would be an element of that. But nonetheless, we have an obligation to keep ourselves together, do what we can within the limits, personal limits that we have.
Cardinal Pell, I'm a priest of the Diocese of Rockville Centre, Long Island, New York. I mention that because my bishop for many years was a guy named John Armagan. He's dead now for over 20 years. People come forward recently and they say, 50 years ago he did something inappropriate, and suddenly his name is sullied. I find myself as a man who knew him, lived with him, loved him, served him, outraged by the fact that someone can be dead, cannot defend themselves, and someone comes up seeking, by the way, great financial reward and decides that 50 years ago he may have done something wrong. I don't find it easy to forgive those who accuse this good man. So I'm intrigued by you, who was so unfairly treated, say in another interview I've seen, I've forgiven my accusers. How in the world, in your heart, have you found the capacity to forgive those who are so unjust?
Well, I think it's a decision you make, and you hope your feelings follow. And I've never met my accuser, but I saw him. He wasn't present in court, but he appeared through video, and he seemed to me to be a very damaged individual. I think he has had nervous trouble. Reputedly, he said to someone that something did happen, but it wasn't me. But certainly with him, I realized that he's damaged goods. He's a victim too. He has certainly suffered. So it wasn't as though my accuser was somebody who's in the top of their game, the top of their form, completely together and explicitly and clear-headedly malevolent. I don't know to what extent what he said was fantasy. I don't know to what extent it was fiction. He did change his story 24 times, which isn't a bad effort. But anyhow, I didn't find that too hard to forgive him. Occasionally, I got very cross with the lawyers, the opposition lawyers, because I felt that they were trying to confuse the situation rather than to bring light and to clarify it. But I suppose that's that. My own lawyers said that probably the prosecutor couldn't believe his luck when he managed to get a jury after 4 or 5 days of discussion to agree with him.
In America, our own Cardinal Joe Bernardine, falsely accused and suffered terribly, ultimately decides to meet with his accuser after it's all over and to let him know that there's room for reconciliation. Do you anticipate there would ever be an opportunity for you to meet the man who made the accusation?
I'd be happy to meet with him. I'd be interested as to whether he would, because I suspect he realizes he's got some unresolved business. Once or twice during the case, during the trial, he paused and paused and paused, and I wondered whether he was going to say then, yes, I've got this wrong. But then he rallied and he went on. Now that I might have mistaken that. One of the lawyers in my team had a similar feeling. But I'm certainly happy to meet with him. And I'd be inclined to say, look, I don't know you. I've never met you. There was no basic incident that could be developed from which you might say that. See, it was one of the difficulties is a lot of people in the Australian establishment have got no idea what a great cathedral is like after a big Sunday Mass.
Right.
Hundreds of people present, 50 people in the choir, 20 servers, 15 at any rate, sacristans, money counters, collectors, all in procession around. It's a very implausible setting for a crime like that, especially on two. Nobody said that I knew the kids, and they could have been. It was quite a good school. They could have been children of two judges, or the police chief, or anybody. It was totally implausible. But so I'd certainly be prepared to meet him. But I'd say,
all right. And
what's the story?
Cardinal Pell, we had our own President Nixon years ago, who was being interviewed by David Frost. And the question put to him was, the Democratic Congress obviously had no love for you, and the media certainly had no love for you. So did they do you in when it came to his being driven from office? And President Nixon said, while they may have hated me, I gave them the sword that allowed them to do me in. In the same way, in the church, what mistakes have we made? How have we corrected them? How can we make sure this whole problem of abuse never happens again?
Well, the undoubtedly what soured public opinion was the pedophilia crisis, the extent and number of the crimes. The second thing was that it wasn't always well dealt with. In a recent interview, I pointed out that we set up national procedures for adjudicating these crimes, providing compensation and counselling in 96 and 97. That's about 5 or 6 years before the big Boston revelations. We got in pretty early on this. I was one of the pioneers, one of the first in the world to set up such a system. It was ironic in some ways that I was scapegoated or picked out. So we've, I think the public is much better informed about the danger of pedophilia. The priests are. It wasn't spoken about. It was taboo. A little bit like today, pedophilia in non-institutional situations. There's a big taboo on that, on what happens in families and outside institutions. People don't like to talk about it. I can understand that. The pendulum has swung. Once upon a time, the victims would not be believed.
Yeah.
To some extent, unfortunately, the pendulum has swung too far the other way, and people are inclined to jump the gun and say if somebody's accused, they must be guilty.
Yeah.
Now, an important protector of civilization is the principle we have, certainly in the English-speaking world, that a person is innocent until they're proved guilty. And that's important to maintain that. And you see, it's very easy. You mentioned this, the bishop who's dead. It's very easy to get rid of a problem. Somebody accuses somebody who's dead and say, oh, well, I don't know whether it happens or not, but we'll give them some money and they'll go away. I would never cooperate to that in such an approach, because I said each case should be investigated to the extent that it possibly can be. And I was very reluctant, unless there was overwhelming evidence, to go ahead and presume or conclude guilt if this was the only case and it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's very difficult to discern the truth there, but the presumption of innocence should remain.
Right. Now, let me ask you, it's a leadership question related to everything you're saying. I had the privilege back in 1980 of forming a friendship with Cardinal Basil Hume, and we maintained that until he died. But one of the things he said he thought was an advantage for him was that he did not come up through the church ranks. He was a monk and an abbot, and the choice of him as Archbishop of Westminster was a surprise. He said, that one of the problems sometimes in the step-up move of bishops and archbishops and cardinals is that sometimes you get where you're going by going along to get along and keeping quiet. And that to rock the boat and say, we're doing this wrong, we've got to change directions for the church is not easy for a man who's moving through the ranks. Now, I say that with the exception, Cardinal Pell, of you, because the one thing everyone's always said is you kind of always spoke your mind, spoke your truth in season and out of season. But is it possible in terms of forming leaders, we don't necessarily pick leaders in the church who will say what they have to say no matter what, so that they would have said years ago, wait a second, we can't reassign a guy who's been accused of offending children to another parish until we're sure he's not really bothered with that particular malady. What do we do to make sure leaders will lead?
We can't guarantee that. We do our best. If I could say a word or two about the old situation.
Yeah.
I think it's probably true that we didn't understand fully the damage that was done to the victims.
Yeah.
I think it was certainly true that most people didn't understand how, I don't know whether the technical word is addictive, that serious pedophiles, they might resolve to be good, and because of the force of habit, find it almost impossible. We, in the late 80s, perhaps early 90s, a lot of good bishops thought that by sending abusers off to psychological clinics, they would be able to reform them. Well, that didn't. That was a mistaken belief, but often it was entered into with the best intentions. But the temptation just to go along exists in every society, exists in religious life too. Cardinal Hume's monastery of Ampleforth has had desperate trouble itself, so much so it was threatened with deregistration. So it's, I think by and large we've got good leaders. Now, once you're in charge of a diocese, there's trouble enough that's forced on you. I can understand the instinct is not to look for trouble, but I too wonder about the past. Now, I don't find it spectacularly difficult to understand 50 years ago, if there'd been an isolated case and the person seemed repentant and there might have been some psychological, that they say, well, we'll give you another chance.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find very, very difficult, almost impossible to believe, and we had one such case in my diocese, is where there were repeated falls and repeated being sent to somewhere else. I just, even in terms of that day and age, I find that difficult to understand just how it could happen.
Your Eminence, we're running to the end of this interview, and I wanted to end with one question that's important. Two of our great American Australians, Ray Kerrison, who wrote a great book on Bishop Walsh of Maryknoll, and Matthew Kelly, who runs dynamiccatholic.com, two great Catholics of Australian extraction. But I mentioned that because I asked them the same question I want to ask you. Before the experience of accusation, when you would pray, how hard was it to accept the hardest challenge, I think, in our faith, thy will be done? And how well or how poorly do you think you embraced the command to truly accept the will of God when it was so patently unfair?
Well, I think as a preliminary, it's good to be a realist.
Mm.
Some people have said, could you believe that you were where you were? And yeah, I had no problem accepting that I was in jail and that I was found guilty.
Yeah.
And then you're in that situation and you've got to try to make the best of it as a believing Christian.
I want to thank Cardinal George Pell for being with us. I hope our listeners and watchers around the world will get hold of his journals. There are 3 editions, actually, 3 volumes. And Your Eminence, look, I could understand if after this thing you took off and were never heard from again. I love the fact that you're willing to talk about the experience and share the ups and downs, the challenges to faith, the difficulties of being falsely accused, the ability to forgive. Thank you for being so articulate in talking about this issue so openly and honestly, and do us a favor and live a long time so you can continue to change hearts and minds and bring more people back to the goodness of the church.
That's very kind. Thanks, Monsignor.
Thank you so much. As we end today's program, I want to thank you all for being with us. If you have any comments to make, please send them to me at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.